I spent 32 years building a life I could look at in the mirror without flinching. My husband, Robert, and I raised our son, David, in a modest but solid home here in Portland, Oregon. We weren't the kind of people who flashed money. We were the kind who fixed things when they broke and paid off the mortgage 5 years early. When Robert passed away from a sudden heart attack 5 years ago, the silence in the house was deafening, but I found comfort in what he left behind: the house, his pension, our carefully tended investments. It wasn't a fortune that would make headlines, but it was enough. Enough for me to live with dignity, and enough, I thought, to leave a meaningful legacy. David had always been the center of our world, a good son, or so I told myself during the lonely nights after Robert died. He called regularly. He visited on holidays. He brought his wife, Jessica, and my 2 beautiful grandchildren for Sunday dinners. I played the role I thought I was born for: the doting grandmother, the supportive mother. I babysat whenever asked. I wrote checks for emergencies, a new roof, a transmission repair, unexpected bills. Was I being a grandmother, or was I being an ATM? I didn't let myself ask that question back then. Love, I believed, was about saying yes. But the first crack in the porcelain didn't appear with a bang. It appeared with a lie. 6 months ago, David called, his voice tight, pitched to that specific frequency of distress that makes a mother's heart stop. They needed $15,000. Jessica's mother, he said, had cancer. Treatments the insurance wouldn't cover. I didn't hesitate. I didn't ask for proof. I transferred the money the next morning, feeling a warm glow of purpose because I could help family. That glow turned to ice 2 weeks later. We were at dinner, roast chicken and winter vegetables, and I turned to Jessica, touching her hand gently. "How is she recovering, dear? Is the treatment hard on her?" Jessica blinked, her fork pausing halfway to her mouth. She looked at me with genuine confusion. Recovering from what? The silence that followed lasted only a second, but it stretched into an eternity. David jumped in, too loud, too fast. Mom must have misunderstood Jess. It was preventive, just a scare, but I saw it. I saw the panic in his eyes and the sudden, sharp realization in hers. The lie hung over the table like a bad smell. After that, I started paying attention, really paying attention. I watched the way Jessica's jaw tightened whenever I mentioned my investment portfolio. I noticed how David steered every conversation toward my eventual plans. There were the casual, cruel suggestions about moving into assisted living. "You're getting older, Mom," he'd say, pouring himself a glass of my wine. "Wouldn't it be easier somewhere smaller, somewhere with help?" I was 71 years old. I ran 3 miles every morning before he was even out of bed. What exactly did they think I needed assistance with? Then came the morning that shattered everything. I was sitting in my kitchen, the morning light streaming through the windows Robert had installed with his own hands. The coffee was hot, the house was quiet, and I felt a sense of peace. Then, my phone buzzed against the granite countertop. David's name flashed on the screen. I smiled instinctively, expecting a photo of Charlie or Mia on their way to school. Instead, I read words that felt like a physical slap across the face. "Don't expect me to take care of you when you're old. I have my own life and family." I stared at the screen. My hands began to tremble, a fine, uncontrollable shaking that rattled the coffee cup when I tried to pick it up. I read it again, and again. There was no context, no preceding argument. We had eaten dinner just 3 days ago, and everything had seemed fine, or at least the surface was fine. What had triggered this? Was it a bad day? Or had this resentment been simmering beneath the surface for years, rotting the foundation of our relationship while I was busy baking cookies and writing checks? I sat there for nearly an hour. The coffee grew cold, forming a bitter skin on top. The sun moved across the floorboards. In that hour, I went through the stages of grief. First, shock. Then, a desperate urge to fix it, to call him, to beg, to apologize for being a burden I hadn't even asked to be. "I'll hire a nurse," I thought wildly. "I'll promise never to ask for a ride." But then, something shifted. I straightened my spine, sitting up tall the way Robert always admired. I looked around the home I managed perfectly well on my own. I looked at my running shoes by the door. I thought about the lie about the cancer treatment. I thought about the $47,000 I had loaned them over the last 4 years. They didn't see me as a person. They saw me as an obligation with a bank account. And now, David was preemptively quitting a job he hadn't even been hired for. I took a deep breath. I didn't type a paragraph. I didn't cry into the digital void. I typed 2 words. Okay. Just that. Nothing more. I hit send and set the phone down face down. My heart was pounding against my ribs like a trapped bird, but my hands were suddenly steady. If David wanted to draw a line in the sand, I would respect it. But respect works both ways. That afternoon, I didn't call David. I didn't call Jessica. I picked up the phone and dialed a number I hadn't used since the probate closed on Robert's estate. Chen and Associates, the receptionist answered. "This is Margaret Morrison," I said, my voice sounding clearer, colder than I had ever heard it. "I need to speak to Thomas. I need to revise my will. Today." "Of course, Mrs. Morrison. Is everything all right?" I looked out the window at the garden I had tended for 3 decades, seeing it with new eyes. It wasn't just a garden anymore. It was an asset. It was mine. "Everything is perfectly clear," I replied. For the first time in years, everything is perfectly clear. I spent the next 48 hours not in mourning, but in calculation. Who deserved the life Robert and I had built? I sat at my dining room table, surrounded by lists, tax returns, and research on local charities. The answer came easier than I expected. By the time I walked into Thomas Chen's office on Thursday morning, I wasn't asking for advice. I was giving instructions. The meeting took less than an hour. Thomas, a man of few words and sharp instincts, listened without interrupting. He didn't offer platitudes about family unity. He didn't ask if I was sure. He simply took notes in his neat, cramped handwriting. "I want to set up a living trust, Thomas," I told him, my voice steady. "And I want to transfer my primary assets into it immediately. The house, the investment portfolio, the pension, everything." Thomas leaned back, studying me over the rim of his glasses. "Margaret, that is a significant step. Once assets are in an irrevocable trust, the control shifts. It's designed to be permanent. Are you doing this to avoid probate, or is there another reason?" "I'm doing it for protection," I said, meeting his gaze. "From anyone who might try to claim I am incompetent. From anyone who sees my death as a payday. Specifically, from my son." There, I had said it aloud. The truth hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Thomas nodded slowly, his expression shifting from lawyer to ally. "I understand. I'll draw up the papers. But Margaret, this will take time. And you need to be aware, if David has any access to your financial information, he will see the activity." My blood ran cold. The joint account. Years ago, when Robert first got sick, we had added David to our primary checking account. It was a safety measure, a just in case, so he could pay bills if I was at the hospital with Robert. I had meant to close it after the funeral. I had meant to remove his name. But in the haze of grief, I had forgotten. That account was the hub of my financial life. He checks it? I realized, the horror settling in my stomach. He checks it regularly. That's how he knew when I had cash available for those loans. He's been watching me. "Then we act today," Thomas said firmly. "Close it." Leaving his office, I felt a strange cocktail of adrenaline and nausea. I drove directly to Pacific Northwest Bank, the branch where Robert and I had banked for 30 years. The lobby smelled of floor wax and old money. I walked to the desk of the manager, Patricia, a woman I had known since she was a teller. "Mrs. Morrison," she smiled warmly. "How can we help you today?" "I need to close my joint account with David," I said. "And I need to open a new individual account at a different bank. Today, right now." Patricia's smile faltered. "Is everything all right? It's unusual to close an account with such a long history." "Everything is fine, Patricia. I'm just simplifying." I lied. It wasn't simple. As I signed the papers, I felt like I was severing an umbilical cord. That account was the last administrative link between David and me. By closing it, I was blinding him. He wouldn't see my spending. He wouldn't see my balances. He would be in the dark. I walked out of the bank with a cashier's check for the balance and a new sense of power. I drove to a competitor bank across town, opened a new account, and routed all my automatic payments there. By the time I got home, I was exhausted, but lighter. The silence lasted 3 days. It took that long for the digital transfer to hit, or perhaps for David to log in for his weekly surveillance. On Monday evening, my phone rang. David's name. My stomach clenched. A reflex born of years of maternal worry. I let it ring. Twice. 3 times. The phone stopped, then immediately started again. He called 4 times in a row. The persistence wasn't out of concern. It was out of panic. On the 5th call, I picked up. "Where have you been?" His voice was sharp, laced with an anxiety I hadn't heard since he was a teenager. "I've been trying to reach you for an hour." "I've been busy," I said, keeping my tone neutral, pleasant. "What do you need, David?" "What do I?" "Mom, the account is gone. I tried to log in to check on things, and it says, account closed. What did you do?" "I closed it." "You, what?" "I closed it," I repeated, enunciating clearly. "It was an old account. I decided to streamline my banking. I moved everything to a new institution." "Streamline?" He sounded choked. "Mom, you can't just do that. You can't just move money around without telling me. That account, I'm on that account. It was my money, David. You were a signatory for emergencies. There is no emergency." "This is crazy." His voice rose an octave. "First the cryptic text, now this? Are you sick? Is something wrong with your head? Has someone been talking to you? A scammer?" "The only person talking to me is you," I said quietly. "Remember? Don't expect me to take care of you. I have my own life." There was a pause on the line, a heavy, suffocating silence. "I was upset," he muttered. "I didn't mean it like that." "You meant every word," I said, and to my surprise, I didn't feel like crying. I felt formidable. "And I am simply respecting your wishes. You have clearly stated you do not want the burden of caring for me. That is fine. I accept that. But David, boundaries work both ways. If you don't want the responsibility of being my son, you don't get the privileges of being my heir." "What? What are you talking about?" His voice trembled now. "Mom, don't do this. Don't be stupid." "Stupid? I mean, stubborn. Don't be stubborn. Good night, David." I hung up before he could respond. My hand hovered over the phone, tempted to turn it off completely. My heart wasn't racing anymore. The fear was gone, replaced by a cold, hard clarity. Thomas called 2 days later. "The trust documents are ready for signature," he said. "Once you sign these, the house and the investments move into the Margaret Morrison Living Trust. You will be the trustee during your lifetime, but the beneficiaries are locked in." I went to his office. I signed the papers. I watched as the paralegal notarized the documents that effectively disinherited my only child. The beneficiaries were carefully chosen: a scholarship fund at Robert's alma mater, the animal shelter where we found our dog Max, and the children's hospital. David's name appeared nowhere. "It's done," Thomas said, handing me a copy. "Legally, these assets are now fortified." I drove home through the familiar streets of my neighborhood. I passed the park where I used to push David on the swings. I passed the ice cream shop where we celebrated his high school graduation. The memories were there, ghosts on the street corners, but they felt distant now, like scenes from a movie I had watched a long time ago. I thought it was over. I thought the legal wall would be enough. But on Saturday morning, while I was pruning the roses in my front garden, I heard the screech of tires. A car slammed into my driveway, mounting the curb. The door flew open. David didn't walk up the path, he ran. And looking at his face, red and contorted with fury, I realized I had made a terrible miscalculation. I hadn't just cut off a bank account. I had cornered a desperate animal. I didn't even have time to stand up before David burst through my garden gate, the latch clattering loudly against the wood. His face was a mask of flushed skin and popping veins, unrecognizable from the little boy I used to walk to school. "What the hell have you done?" he shouted, his voice cracking with intensity. I set down my pruning shears carefully on the grass. I made sure to move slowly, deliberately, refusing to mirror his chaotic energy. I looked up at him, shielding my eyes from the sun. "Lower your voice, David. The neighbors are in their yards." "I don't care about the neighbors." He stepped onto the flower bed, crushing a row of marigolds under his heavy boots. I just got off the phone with the bank. They said you transferred almost everything, not just the checking account, the savings, the investment portfolio, everything. Where did it go? It went into a trust, I said, dusting the dirt from my knees as I finally stood up. I was 5'4". He was 6'1". He cast a long, dark shadow over me. It is none of your concern. None of my? He stepped closer, looming over me, invading my personal space in a way he never had before. I could smell the stale coffee on his breath, see the wild, desperate look in his eyes. That money was supposed to be mine, Mom. Dad worked his whole life for that money. The mention of Robert made my blood heat. Dad worked his whole life for us. I corrected him, my voice trembling not with fear, but with a sudden, white-hot anger. For our family, for our security. He is gone now, and it is my money. Mine to do with as I please. It is not a holding tank for your future. You can't do this, he spat, his hands balling into fists at his sides. I'll fight it. I'll hire a lawyer. I'll prove you're not competent. You're spending it, hiding it. You're clearly not all there. I took a step forward, forcing him to take a step back. Try it, I whispered. I have medical records from last week showing I am in perfect health. I have witnesses to my sound mind. I have documentation of every decision I've made. What do you have, David? A text message telling me you won't take care of me? A history of borrowing money you never paid back? His face went pale. The wind seemed to go out of his sails, replaced by a cold, calculating stare. You don't understand, he said, his voice dropping to a hiss. We need that money. We've been counting on it. For what? I asked. You have a job. Jessica has a degree. You have a home. What do you need it for so desperately that you're screaming at your mother in her garden? He didn't answer. He just stared at me, and in that silence, I saw the truth. It wasn't about need. It was about expectation. He had already spent my money in his mind. I was just the obstacle standing between him and the payout. Get out of my house, I said quietly. He didn't move. Get out, I screamed, a sound that ripped from my throat, raw and primal. And don't come back unless you are invited. He looked at me with something like disgust, then turned on his heel and stormed back to his car. The engine roared, tires squealed, and he was gone. I stood in the garden for a long time, staring at the crushed marigolds. My hands started to shake again, violent tremors that traveled up my arms. I wasn't just angry anymore. I was terrified. The look in his eyes hadn't been frustration. It had been hatred. I went inside, locked the front door, the back door, and checked the window latches. I poured myself a glass of water, but I couldn't drink it. I called Thomas immediately. It started, I told him, my voice tight. He came here. He was aggressive. He threatened to prove I was incompetent. We expected this, Thomas said, his voice a calm anchor. But his aggression is actually good for us legally. It shows desperation. Margaret, we need to add a layer of protection. I want you to write a letter. A letter? A letter of intent. It's a document written in your own words, explaining exactly why you are disinheriting him. If he challenges the will or the trust in court, claiming you were confused or unduly influenced, this letter will speak for you. It needs to be handwritten. It needs to be raw, but factual. Write down what happened. Write down the text message. Write down the confrontation today. I spent the rest of the afternoon sitting at Robert's old oak desk. The house was silent, but my mind was loud. How do you explain to a stranger, a judge, a lawyer that your child has failed you? How do you document betrayal without sounding bitter? I picked up the pen. The ink flowed onto the crisp white paper. To David, this letter confirms that I, Margaret Ann Morrison, being of sound mind and body, have chosen to establish a living trust and designate beneficiaries according to my own wishes. This decision was not made in haste, nor was it made under the influence of any third party. It was made in response to your own words. On the morning of October 12th, you wrote to me, "Don't expect me to take care of you when you're old. I have my own life and family." Those words clarified our relationship. You defined the terms. We are separate. You have your life, and I have mine. For years, I believed we were a family that supported one another. I see now that I was the support, and you were the dependent. I have reviewed my finances and realized that over the last 4 years, I have given you nearly $50,000 for emergencies that were never fully explained. I allowed myself to be used because I loved you. But love does not require me to be a victim, and it certainly does not require me to finance the lifestyle of someone who views my existence as a burden. This is not punishment, David. This is self-preservation. I am securing my future so that I never have to ask you for the care you so clearly refuse to give. I am not incompetent. I am simply awake. Signed, Margaret Morrison. I read it over. Tears pricked my eyes, hot and stinging. It felt like writing an obituary for my son, even though he was still alive. But as I folded the paper and placed it in an envelope marked "Legal, Do Not Open," I felt a steel door close in my heart. I was ready for the fight, but I wasn't ready for the weapon they would use next. Silence is a heavy thing, but peace is heavier. For 3 weeks, the phone didn't ring. The driveway remained empty. I moved through my days like a ghost haunting my own house, jumpy at the sound of the mail carrier, checking the locks twice before bed. I knew David. I knew that the rage I saw in the garden wouldn't just evaporate. It would curdle into something more strategic. They didn't come back with shouting. They came back with smiles. It was a Sunday morning, bright and deceptive. I was having breakfast, toast, and tea, the crumbs stark against the dark wood of the table when I heard the car. Not a screech of tires this time, but a gentle engine purr. Then, the sound that disarmed every defense I had built, the high-pitched, chaotic laughter of children, my grandchildren. I went to the window, peering through the slats of the blinds. David was lifting 4-year-old Mia out of her car seat. Jessica was smoothing down 6-year-old Charlie's hair. They were dressed up, looking like a catalog family. David held a bouquet of flowers. Jessica carried a Tupperware container. It was a tableau of domestic perfection, staged specifically for an audience of one. I opened the door before they could ring the bell. I couldn't help it. My body moved before my brain could scream stop. "Grandma," Charlie ran forward, bypassing the tension, bypassing the history. Just a little boy happy to see the person who always had ice cream in the freezer. My heart clenched so hard it hurt physically. I crouched down, catching him in a hug. He smelled of grass and fruit snacks, the scent of innocence. Mia followed, shyly wrapping her arms around my neck. For a moment, buried in their warmth, I forgot the trust, the text message, the lawyer. I was just Grandma. Then I looked up. Over their small heads, I met David's eyes. He was smiling, but it didn't reach his eyes. It was a tight, grimacing thing, a baring of teeth disguised as warmth. "We thought we'd surprise you," Jessica said brightly, stepping forward. She was wearing a soft beige coat, looking harmless. "It's such a beautiful day. We missed you, Margaret." "You should have called," I said, standing up, keeping a hand on Charlie's shoulder, as if to shield him. "We tried," David said, his voice smooth. "You haven't been answering. And the kids, well, they kept asking why Grandma doesn't come over anymore. We didn't know what to tell them. The guilt trip was immediate and precise. Reject us, and you reject them. It was a hostage situation wrapped in a Sunday visit. "Come inside," I said, stepping aside. What choice did I have? They settled into the living room like they had never left. The children sprawled on the rug with coloring books Jessica had conveniently brought. David and Jessica sat on my sofa, the sofa Robert and I had bought for our 20th anniversary, and set the Tupperware on the coffee table. "I made your favorite," Jessica said, popping the lid. "Oatmeal raisin cookies." I looked at the cookies. I looked at her. "So," I said, my voice flat, "is this the part where we pretend nothing happened?" "Mom, please," David started, leaning forward, elbows on his knees. "We want to apologize. We do. I handled things badly. I was stressed. Work has been a nightmare. The bills are piling up, and when I saw the account closed, I just snapped. I didn't mean the things I said." "Which things?" I asked, glancing at the children to make sure they were occupied. "The text message telling me you wouldn't care for me? Or the threat to prove I'm incompetent?" "All of it," he said quickly. "It was just noise, Mom, just anger. We're family. Family forgives. Family protects, I countered. Family doesn't view their mother as a retirement plan. Jessica jumped in, her voice soft, conciliatory. Margaret, we're just worried about you. Making huge financial changes like that, isolating yourself. It's not like you. We just want to make sure you're okay, that you're not being taken advantage of. The only people who have ever taken advantage of me are sitting on my sofa, I said. The air in the room changed. The temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Jessica's smile didn't falter, but her eyes went cold. Charlie, Mia, she called out, her voice cheerful but sharp. Why don't you two go play in the backyard? Look at Grandma's garden. I bet there are butterflies. But I want a cookie, Charlie whined. Go, now. The children scrambled up, sensing the shift in atmospheric pressure, and ran out the back door. The moment the latch clicked shut, the performance ended. Jessica slumped back against the cushions, crossing her arms. David stopped, leaning forward. Let's cut the crap, Margaret, Jessica said. Her voice was unrecognizable from the sweet tone she'd used seconds ago. You're being selfish. You have more money than you'll ever need, and you're hoarding it while your own family struggles. Struggles? I gestured to the window where their Mercedes was parked. You drive a luxury car. The children go to private school. You vacation in Aspen. That is not struggle, Jessica. That is living beyond your means. That is none of your business, David snapped. It became my business when you expected me to pay for it. I stood up, unable to sit still any longer. I am not an ATM with a heartbeat, David. I am your mother. But you haven't treated me like a mother in years. You treat me like a waiting room for your inheritance. We need that trust dissolved, David said, his voice low and dangerous. We need the assets moved back. If you do that, we can go back to normal. Sunday dinners, holidays, being a family. And if I don't? David looked at Jessica. She gave a microscopic nod. If you don't, Jessica said, inspecting her manicured fingernails, then you clearly don't value family. And if you don't value family, you don't need to see the grandchildren. The world stopped. The buzzing of the refrigerator, the ticking of the clock, it all went silent. What did you say? I whispered. You heard me, she said, looking me dead in the eye. We'll move if we have to. We'll cut contact. We will tell Charlie and Mia that Grandma doesn't love them enough to help their parents. They will grow up forgetting you. It was a physical blow, a punch to the gut that left me breathless. They knew exactly where the armor was weak. They were willing to weaponize two innocent children to get access to a bank account. I looked at David, my son. I waited for him to object. I waited for him to say, no, Jess, that's too far. He just stared at me, his jaw set in stubborn defiance. It's your choice, Mom. Money or us. Nausea roiled in my stomach. I felt the bile rise in my throat. This was extortion, pure and simple. Get out, I said. My voice was trembling, but not with fear this time, with revulsion. Mom, think about it. Get out. I pointed to the door. Get out of my house. Take your cookies. Take your fake apologies. And if you ever use those children as leverage again, I will make sure the entire world knows exactly what kind of parents you are. They stood up, sneering. Jessica grabbed her purse. You're making a mistake, Margaret. You're going to die alone in this big house, and it will be your own fault. They marched out the back door, snatching the confused children from the grass. Come on, kids. Grandma is tired. We have to go. But we just got here, Charlie wailed. Get in the car, David yelled. I watched through the window as they shoved the crying children into the back seat. The Mercedes reversed aggressively out of the driveway and sped off. I turned away from the window and ran to the bathroom. I barely made it before I dry heaved over the toilet, my body rejecting the stress, the cruelty, the absolute heartbreak of it. I sat on the cold tile floor, wiping my mouth, tears streaming down my face. I had lost them. I had lost the grandchildren. The silence in the house was no longer peaceful. It was a tomb. But as I sat there, shivering, a new thought formed. It started small and grew into a roaring fire. They are unfit. Anyone who would use their children like poker chips is dangerous. I pulled myself up using the sink. I splashed cold water on my face. I looked at the pale, shaking woman in the mirror. No, I told her. You do not surrender. I walked to the kitchen and picked up the phone. I dialed Thomas. They just left, I said, my voice raspy. They threatened to cut me off from the grandchildren unless I reversed the trust. Did they say it explicitly? Thomas asked sharply. Yes. They offered me an ultimatum. Money or the kids. Write it down, Thomas commanded. Word for word. Date it. Time it. Margaret, this isn't just a dispute anymore. If they are using the children as extortion tools, we document it. Because if they try to prove you incompetent, we are going to prove they are predatory. I grabbed my pen. My hand was shaking, but the ink flowed. I wasn't just fighting for my money anymore. I was fighting for the truth. The war didn't begin with a shout. It began with a courier envelope delivered at 8 a.m. on a rainy Tuesday. I signed for it, my hand steady, though my heart hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Inside was a letter from a law firm downtown, one of those aggressive outfits that advertised on billboards. The language was cold, clinical, and devastating. Petition for guardianship. Our client, David Morrison, alleges that Margaret Ann Morrison is suffering from diminished mental capacity and is no longer fit to manage her financial or personal affairs. We respectfully request that you submit to an independent psychiatric evaluation. I sat at my kitchen table, the paper shaking in my grip. Diminished capacity. My son was telling the world I was crazy. He was trying to strip me of my rights, to reduce me to the status of a child, all to get his hands on the money I had denied him. I called Thomas. They're going for the jugular, I said, my voice surprisingly calm. They want a psych evaluation. Let them, Thomas replied, and I could hear the grim satisfaction in his voice. Margaret, this is a mistake on their part. They are betting on you being a frail, confused old woman. They have no idea who they are dealing with. We agree to the evaluation, but on our terms. We choose the doctor from the court-approved list. We control the battlefield. 1 week later, I sat in the office of Dr. Patricia Hernandez. She was a forensic psychiatrist with eyes like lasers and a demeanor that tolerated no nonsense. For 3 hours, she dismantled my life. She asked about my history, my finances, my daily routine. She gave me memory tests that felt insulting, count backward from 100 by sevens. Remember these 3 words, but I performed them with surgical precision. At the end of the session, she closed her folder. Mrs. Morrison, she said, leaning forward, I will file my official report, but off the record, I see this pattern often. Adult children who view their inheritance as a birthright often mistake parental autonomy for senility. They cannot conceive that you are saying no simply because you want to. They assume you must be broken. I'm not broken, I said. No, she smiled, a rare, sharp thing. You are formidable, and that is what frightens them. The hearing was scheduled for November 15th. The courtroom smelled of lemon polish and old anxiety. I wore my best navy suit, the one I'd worn to Robert's funeral. I sat next to Thomas, keeping my back straight, my hands folded in my lap. Across the aisle, David and Jessica sat with their lawyer, a man in a shiny gray suit who checked his watch every 2 minutes. David wouldn't look at me. He stared straight ahead, his jaw clenched so tight a muscle jumped in his cheek. Jessica was playing the role of the concerned daughter-in-law, dabbing at dry eyes with a tissue. The proceedings were brutal. David's lawyer stood up and painted a picture of a woman unmoored by grief. Your Honor, he bloviated. Margaret Morrison is a widow living in isolation. She has recently made erratic, drastic financial decisions, liquidating accounts, disinheriting her only child, creating complex trusts. These are not the actions of a rational mind. These are the actions of a woman suffering from paranoia, likely early-stage dementia. My client, her loving son, simply wants to protect her from herself. I dug my fingernails into my palms to keep from screaming. Loving son. The audacity was breathtaking. Then, Dr. Hernandez took the stand. She didn't use flowery language. She used data. She walked the judge through my test scores, perfect recall, superior logic processing, above-average financial literacy for my age group. In my professional opinion, Dr. Hernandez stated, her voice cutting through the room, Mrs. Morrison is not only competent, she is exceptionally sharp. Her decision to place her assets in a trust is a sophisticated legal strategy, perfectly rational, given the family dynamics. But surely, David's lawyer interrupted, disinheriting one's only child is a sign of emotional instability? On the contrary, Dr. Hernandez replied coolly, it is a sign of a person exerting their will. Whether you agree with her choice is irrelevant to her capacity to make it. The judge, a stern woman with reading glasses perched on the end of her nose, turned her gaze to David. Mr. Morrison, she said, the respondent has submitted evidence into the record. Specifically, a text message sent from your phone number on October 12th. She picked up a piece of paper. It reads, "Don't expect me to take care of you when you're old. I have my own life and family. Did you send this?" David's face flushed a deep, ugly red. He stood up, smoothing his jacket nervously. I was upset, Your Honor. It was a heat-of-the-moment thing." "You were upset?" the judge repeated. "And now, you are petitioning this court to grant you guardianship over the very woman you refuse to care for. You claim she is incompetent because she took you at your word?" "It's not. It's about the money, Your Honor. She's throwing away our inheritance." "It is her money, Mr. Morrison," the judge snapped. "Not yours." She banged her gavel. The sound cracked like a gunshot. Petition denied. The court finds Margaret Morrison to be of sound mind and body. She retains full control over her estate and person. Case dismissed. The relief was so sudden it made me dizzy. I let out a breath I felt I had been holding for months. Thomas squeezed my shoulder. "You did it, Margaret." We filed out of the courtroom. The hallway was crowded, but the space around David felt empty. He was waiting for me. He stepped into my path, blocking me. His lawyer was already walking away, defeated. Jessica was nowhere to be seen. It was just David and me. I looked at him, searching for the boy who used to bring me dandelions. I looked for the young man I had dropped off at college. They were gone. In their place was a stranger with cold, dead eyes. "This isn't over," he whispered, stepping close enough that I could smell his sweat. "You think you won? You're going to die alone, Mother. And when you're sick, when you're scared, don't you dare call me." Thomas stepped forward, intervening, but I held up a hand. I didn't need protection. Not anymore. "I won't call you, David," I said, my voice steady and quiet. "I have friends. I have a community. I have my dignity. And I have the peace of knowing I am not the one who tried to destroy my own family for a paycheck." "You're a bitter old woman," he spat. "And you," I said, "are a disappointment." He recoiled as if I had slapped him. For the first time, I saw the armor crack. I walked past him, down the long marble hallway, my heels clicking on the floor. I didn't look back. I walked out into the crisp November air. The sun was shining. I had won in the eyes of the law. But as I stood on the courthouse steps, a hollow ache opened up in my chest. I had kept my money. I had kept my freedom. But I had lost my son. "Are you okay?" Thomas asked gently. "No," I said honestly, "but I will be." I didn't know then that the victory in court was just the beginning. The real truth, the dark, calculated truth of what David and Jessica had actually been doing, was about to come to light. And it was worse than I could have imagined. Victory, I discovered, is a quiet thing. It doesn't arrive with fireworks. It arrives with the silence of a phone that no longer rings with demands. 2 months after the hearing, the dust had settled. I was rebuilding my life, brick by brick. I joined a book club. I started volunteering at the library. I was learning to breathe again. But the universe has a way of revealing secrets when you stop looking for them. It started with a mistake. A clerical error. A registered letter arrived at my house addressed to David. I almost returned it, but the return address caught my eye. Pacific Mortgage Lenders, Foreclosure Department. My heart skipped a beat. "Foreclosure?" I called the number on the envelope. "I believe you have the wrong address," I told the agent. "My son doesn't live here." "I apologize, ma'am," the weary voice replied. "We've been unable to reach Mr. Morrison at his primary residence. You are listed as the emergency contact on the original loan documents from 8 years ago." Is he losing his house?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "The proceedings have begun, ma'am. He is 6 months behind." I hung up, staring at the wall. 6 months. That meant they had stopped paying their mortgage long before I cut them off. They had been drowning while driving a Mercedes and eating on my china. But why? They had good jobs. Where was the money going? The curiosity wasn't just maternal concern anymore. It was the instinct of a detective. I called Thomas. I need to know, I told him. I need to know the extent of the rot. If they are this desperate, they are dangerous. Thomas hired a forensic accountant and a private investigator. Are you sure you want to see this? He asked, when the file arrived a week later. Open it, I said. The report was a horror story told in numbers. Over the past 6 years, David and Jessica had spent nearly $200,000 beyond their combined income. It wasn't medical bills. It wasn't bad luck. It was vanity, vacations to Europe, a boat they used twice a summer, country club memberships, Jessica's cosmetic surgeries, private school tuitions they couldn't afford. But the numbers weren't the worst part. The worst part was the source of the money. Look at this, Thomas said, pointing to a section highlighted in red. Predatory loans. High interest? Worse. These are inheritance advance loans. Shadow lenders who give cash now in exchange for a claim on a future estate. I felt the room spin. You mean they borrowed against my death? Yes, Thomas said softly. They were so confident you would die and leave them everything and soon that they signed away their future inheritance to pay for their present lifestyle. When you changed the trust, you didn't just cut them off. You triggered a default on these loans. They owe hundreds of thousands of dollars they effectively stole from a future that no longer exists. I felt sick, physically, violently ill. My son hadn't just been waiting for me to die. He had banked on it. He had bet on the timing of my heart stopping. There's more, Thomas said, hesitating. The investigator found email correspondence on David's old laptop, the one you gave him, which he never wiped properly before selling. He slid a printout across the desk. I read the subject line, Legal Options for Expediting Inheritance. Parental Competency. The date was 3 years ago. 3 years ago. Long before the text message. Long before the argument. He had been consulting attorneys about how to declare me incompetent or force a payout for years. While he was eating my roast chicken, while he was hugging me on Mother's Day, he was researching how to bury me. I put the paper down. I didn't cry. I was past tears. I was in a place beyond grief, a cold, sterile landscape of absolute clarity. This is fraud, Thomas said quietly. We could go to the police, the loans, the misrepresentation. It borders on criminal. I thought about Charlie and Mia. I thought about them visiting their father in prison. I thought about the scandal, the public shame. No, I said. No police. I won't destroy my grandchildren's lives to punish their parents. But I want them to know that I know. I want the charade to end. I spent the next day drafting the final letter. I didn't write it with anger. I wrote it with the precision of a surgeon cutting out a tumor. David and Jessica, I am now in possession of your complete financial history. I know about the foreclosure. I know about the spending. But most importantly, I know about the inheritance advance loans you took out against my life. I know you bet on my death. I have seen the emails from 3 years ago where you researched how to force me out of my own home. I have seen the calculations you made regarding my life expectancy. You called me paranoid. You called me senile. But the truth is, you were predators living in my house. I want to be perfectly clear. I will not bail you out. I will not pay off the debts you incurred while waiting for me to die. The trust is ironclad. You will receive nothing. Your financial ruin is a consequence of your own greed. It is yours to carry. However, I am not cruel. I have attached a list of resources for bankruptcy attorneys, debt consolidation, and family counseling. I suggest you use them. For the sake of Charlie and Mia, you need to learn how to live within your reality, not the fantasy of my money. My door is closed to your debts. But if, and only if, you ever reach a place where you can look me in the eye and apologize, not because you are broke, but because you are horrified by what you became, then, perhaps, we can speak. Until then, do not contact me. Margaret. I mailed the letter. I didn't send it registered. I didn't need a signature. I knew they would read it. The silence that followed was different this time. It wasn't the silence of a game. It was the silence of shame. They knew the jig was up. There were no more cards to play, no more threats, No more grandchildren as leverage. They were naked in the light of the truth, and they had nowhere to hide. I sat on my porch, watching the leaves fall from the oak trees. I felt lighter than I had in a decade. The truth is a terrible thing, but it is also the only thing that can set you free. I had lost my son, yes, but I had found myself. And for the first time in a long time, I liked the woman I saw in the mirror. Winter arrived in Portland, painting the city in shades of gray and silver. But inside my home, there was warmth, real warmth. Not the performative heat of a family trying to extract money, but the steady, enduring warmth of a life reclaimed. On Christmas Eve, the snow began to fall, soft and silent. I was preparing a small dinner for my friends Linda from the book club, my niece Emma, who had driven down from Seattle, and Thomas, who had become less of a lawyer and more of a confidant. The house smelled of cinnamon and roasting pine. Then, a knock at the door. I froze. Old instincts die hard. Was it David? Was it another confrontation? I opened the door, bracing myself. Standing on the porch, dusted with snowflakes, were Charlie and Mia. Behind them was a woman I didn't recognize, middle-aged, weary but kind, wearing a lanyard ID, and parked on the street, idling in the gray slush, was a beat-up sedan. David sat in the driver's seat. He didn't look at the house. He stared straight ahead, his hands gripping the steering wheel. "Mrs. Morrison?" the woman asked gently. "I'm Sarah, the court-appointed visitation supervisor. Mr. and Mrs. Morrison have surrendered their custody rights for the holiday. They are currently in transitional housing and felt the children would be better off here for the evening." Transitional housing, bankruptcy. The Mercedes was gone, the boat was gone, the house was gone, the crash had happened. My heart broke for the children, standing there with small backpacks, looking confused and cold. "Come in," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "Oh, sweethearts, come in." I ushered them inside. The warmth of the house seemed to embrace them. Charlie looked around, his eyes wide. "Is it Christmas here, Grandma?" "Yes, Charlie." I hugged him, feeling his cold little ears against my cheek. "It's Christmas here. It's always Christmas here for you." For 4 hours, we didn't talk about money. We didn't talk about lawsuits or trusts or betrayal. We baked cookies, real ones, messy and imperfect. We read stories by the fire. We drank hot chocolate. When Sarah signaled it was time to leave, Mia clung to my leg. "Grandma, can we come back?" I knelt down, looking into her eyes, so like David's were before the world twisted him. "Anytime, my love. The court says you can come every month, and I will be here. I'm not going anywhere." I walked them to the door. I watched them trudge down the snowy path to the waiting car. David still didn't look. He couldn't. The shame was a wall between us, thicker than any brick. He put the car in gear and drove away, taking my heart with him, but leaving my soul intact. 6 months later, spring exploded in the garden. I sat on my patio, drinking tea. My new doctor told me I had the heart of a woman 15 years younger. "Whatever you're doing," she had said, "keep doing it." What I was doing was living. I had joined the board of the Children's Hospital Foundation. I wasn't just a donor on paper. I was there. I read to sick children on Tuesdays. I held the hands of terrified parents. I saw where my money was going, not to a new Mercedes, but to research, to comfort, to life. My scholarship fund at Roberts University had graduated its first student, a brilliant young girl from a poor family who wanted to be an engineer. She sent me a letter. "You changed my life," she wrote. "I will never forget you." This was legacy. It wasn't a bank account passed down to an ungrateful heir. It wasn't a surname carried on by someone who despised me. Legacy was the ripples you made in the water. It was the love you gave to people who actually wanted it. My niece Emma visited often. We talked about art, about politics, about the future. "You're the strongest woman I know, Aunt Margaret," she told me once over lunch. I had to be, I smiled, but I learned late. David and Jessica were still struggling. I heard rumors. Portland is a small town. They were working retail jobs. They were living in a small apartment. They were learning, the hard way, what it meant to earn $1 instead of expecting one. Do I miss my son? every day. I grieve the boy he was, and I grieve the man he could have been. But I do not regret the wall I built. I learned that you cannot save people from themselves, you cannot buy love, and you certainly cannot pay someone to respect you. I looked out at my garden, at the roses blooming in defiant, vibrant red. I picked up my phone. I didn't check for texts. I didn't worry about bank alerts. I sent a photo of the garden to my book club group chat. Blooming beautifully today, I typed. I was talking about the roses, but I was also talking about me. I am Margaret Ann Morrison. I am 72 years old. I am alone, but I am not lonely. I am wealthy, but not just in money. I am free. And if there is one thing I want you to know, it is this. You are allowed to choose yourself, even if it breaks your heart. Because sometimes, the only way to save your family is to stop letting them destroy you.